The white wolf brought back a child's sneaker in the middle of a blizzard. Blood-stained, torn. But the boy she found wasn't the victim, and the blood on her fur didn't belong to him. This is the story of a broken veteran who lost everything to fire, a silent child who couldn't scream for help, and a wolf who killed to protect them both. They didn't know that the organization hunting the boy would burn down a mountain to get what they wanted. And the man had to choose. Keep running like he'd done for 3 years, or face the flames that took his family once before. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we'd never expect. And sometimes, survival means protecting something more precious than your own broken heart. The blizzard hit the North Cascades 3 days before Christmas, the kind that buried roads and erased the world in white static. Silas had seen worse storms during his years as a search and rescue specialist, back when he still believed saving people mattered. Now he just watched the snow pile against his cabin windows and tried not to think about the last fire he couldn't stop. Frost appeared at the door near midnight. The white wolf never knocked, never scratched. She just stood there until Silas felt her presence like a change in air pressure. When he opened the door, wind screamed into the cabin, and Frost dropped something at his feet. A child's sneaker, size 3, maybe 4, red with white laces. The canvas was torn, and dark stains had soaked into the fabric around the heel. Silas looked at the wolf. Her ice-blue eyes held that particular intensity he'd learned to recognize over their 2 years together. Not hunger, not curiosity, urgency. "Where?" he asked. Frost turned and vanished into the screaming white. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his emergency pack, the one he'd sworn he'd never use again after the incident that ended his career. His hands remembered the routine: thermal layers, rope, medical kit, flares. The motions came back like muscle memory, like his body hadn't gotten the message that he'd quit caring. The storm tried to kill them both. Wind stripped the breath from his lungs. Snow hammered his face until his skin went numb. But Frost moved through the chaos like she could see through the white curtain, and Silas followed, because following was easier than thinking about why he was doing this. Echo Canyon opened before them like a wound in the mountain. Frost led him deeper into the ravine where the wind couldn't reach, but the cold pressed closer. The wolf's paws left perfect prints in fresh snow, but Silas noticed something else: drops of red, barely visible in the dim light of his headlamp. Blood. Not much, but enough to track. His pulse quickened with the old instinct, the hunter's reflex he thought had died with his family. Frost wasn't bleeding from her paws. The blood came from somewhere else, smeared in her white fur along her right shoulder. They found the boy wedged in a crack between 2 boulders, barely visible under an overhang of rock. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. His jacket was too thin for this weather, his lips blue with cold. But his eyes were open, watching Silas with that terrible awareness children get when they've been hurt too many times to trust anyone. Around his neck hung a metal chain with a single dog tag. Not the standard military issue. This one was older, scratched, with writing Silas couldn't make out in the darkness. The boy didn't make a sound when Silas reached for him. Not a whimper, not a cry, just that unwavering stare. Silas wrapped the child in his thermal blanket and checked for injuries. Hypothermia, definitely. Dehydration. Bruises on his arms that looked like fingerprints. But no major wounds. No source for the blood. He looked at Frost, who sat 10 feet away, watching them both with those unblinking eyes. The blood on her shoulder fur gleamed wet and fresh in the headlamp beam. "Who did you hurt?" Silas whispered. Frost's ears flicked forward. Then she did something he'd never seen before. She bared her teeth, not in a snarl, but in something else. a grin that showed every fang, the expression of a predator who'd already won the fight. In that moment, Silas understood. The blood wasn't from the boy. It was from whoever had left those bruises on the child's arms. From whoever had abandoned a 6-year-old in a mountain canyon during a blizzard. Frost had found them first, and Frost had made sure they wouldn't follow. The boy's small hand gripped Silas's sleeve. Still no sound. But his fingers dug in with desperate strength, and Silas felt something crack open in his chest. A familiar ache he'd tried to bury under 3 years of isolation. "I've got you," Silas said. The words came out rough, rusty from disuse. "You're safe now." The boy didn't believe him. Silas could see it in those dark eyes. But the child didn't let go either, and that was enough. That was something. Frost stood and moved toward the canyon entrance, ears swiveling to catch sounds the storm swallowed. Alert, protective, still on guard. Because somewhere out there in the screaming white, someone was looking for this boy. Someone who'd left blood on a white wolf's shoulder. Someone who wouldn't stop until they got him back. The storm had swallowed the world by the time they reached the cabin. Silas carried the boy against his chest, feeling the small body shiver despite the thermal blanket. Frost moved ahead like a ghost, her white fur barely visible against the snow. She knew the way home better than he did now. Inside, warmth hit them like a wall. Silas had left the wood stove burning, and the cabin held heat the way good log construction should. He set the boy down on the couch near the fire and started peeling away the wet layers of clothing. The child watched him with those same dark, unreadable eyes. Still no sound, not even breathing loud enough to hear. That's when Silas noticed the scars. Not the fresh bruises, the old marks. Cigarette burns on the inside of the boy's left arm. A poorly healed fracture in the right wrist. Evidence of a life Silas recognized from his years pulling kids out of bad situations. He worked methodically, the way his training had taught him. Check for hypothermia first. Core temperature, extremities, signs of frostbite. The boy's fingers were dangerously cold, toes worse. Silas filled the basin with lukewarm water and began the slow process of warming the child's hands and feet. Too fast would cause tissue damage. Too slow risked permanent injury. The boy didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just sat there like he'd learned that resistance only made things worse. And something about that passive acceptance made Silas's hands shake. Frost pushed through the door Silas had left, cracked and padded across the room. She didn't approach the couch. Instead, she settled on the floor directly in front of it, positioning herself between the boy and the door. Her massive head rested on her paws, but her eyes stayed open, watching, guarding. Silas grabbed the medical kit he'd kept stocked out of habit. Antiseptic for the scrapes, bandages for the cuts. He worked in silence because silence was what the boy seemed to need. No questions, no false comfort, just steady hands doing what needed to be done. When he reached for the dog tag around the child's neck to check for identification, the boy's hand shot up and grabbed his wrist. The grip was surprisingly strong, desperate, a silent plea that needed no words. "Okay," Silas said quietly. "I won't touch it." The boy's hand released, but his eyes held a new expression. Something that might have been gratitude, if the child remembered what gratitude felt like. Silas made soup from a can. Chicken noodle, basic, the kind that didn't require an appetite. He sat on the floor next to Frost and held out the bowl. The boy stared at it like he was trying to solve a complex equation. Trust versus hunger, safety versus survival instinct. Finally, small hands reached out and took the bowl. The child ate slowly, carefully, with the precision of someone who'd learned to make food last. Silas watched and saw himself 3 years ago, sitting in this same cabin, trying to remember how to do basic things like eat and sleep and wake up without screaming. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind howled its fury against the walls. Inside, 3 broken creatures sat together in warm silence. Silas tried to ask questions. "What's your name?" No response. "Can you tell me where you're from?" Nothing. "Do you know who left you out there?" The boy just looked at him with those ancient eyes that had seen too much. That's when understanding clicked into place. The child wasn't choosing silence. Silence was all he had. Silas had worked enough rescue operations to recognize the signs. The way the boy's throat moved when he tried to respond. The frustration that flickered across his face. The automatic gesture toward his neck, then the quick withdrawal. "You can't talk," Silas said. Not a question, a statement. The boy's shoulders dropped. Relief, maybe, or resignation, or both. Frost lifted her head and made a low sound in her chest. Not a growl. Something softer. The noise she made when she found Silas having nightmares and wanted to pull him back to the present. A sound of recognition, of understanding. The wolf knew what it meant to be broken. She'd been half-starved when Silas found her 2 winters ago, caught in a trap some poacher had set illegally. He'd freed her expecting her to run. Instead, she'd stayed. 2 damaged souls who'd somehow found each other in the wilderness. Now there were 3. Silas pulled out a notebook and pencil. "Can you write?" he asked. The boy took the pencil. His hand shook. He managed to draw a simple stick figure, a larger stick figure, a house with flames. Then he dropped the pencil like it had burned him. Silas's chest went tight. He knew that drawing. He'd lived that drawing. Fire and loss and everything disappearing in smoke and heat and screams he could still hear in the quiet moments. He reached out slowly and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The child tensed but didn't pull away. "I know," Silas whispered. "I know what fire takes." For the first time, the boy's eyes filled with tears. Still no sound. But his small body shook with silent sobs, and Silas pulled him close, and Frost pressed against both of them. And they sat there in the firelight like survivors of the same war nobody else could see. Outside, the storm raged on. But somewhere in that storm, someone was coming. Someone who wanted this boy badly enough to leave him for dead when the grab went wrong. Someone who didn't know that Silas had already decided to die on this hill, if that's what it took. Because for the first time in 3 years, he had something worth protecting. The knock came at 2 in the morning. 3 sharp raps that cut through the silence like gunshots. Frost's head snapped up from where she'd been sleeping at the foot of the couch. The sound that came from her throat made the hair on Silas's neck stand straight up. He'd heard Frost warn off black bears, chase coyotes from her territory, even face down a mountain lion once. But this sound was different. Lower, older, the kind of noise that came from somewhere primal, a warning that transcended species. This wasn't aggression. This was recognition of mortal danger. The boy sat up, eyes wide, and pressed himself into the corner of the couch. His small hands clutched the blanket like a shield that might actually protect him. Silas grabbed his rifle from above the door frame and checked the chamber. Loaded, always loaded. 3 years alone in the mountains had taught him that much. He moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. A man stood on the porch in full park ranger uniform. Green and gray, crisp and official, the kind that looked fresh out of the package. He was big, 6'3" maybe, with the build of someone who knew how to handle himself. His face had that weathered look rangers got from years outdoors, and when he smiled at the window, it seemed genuine enough. "Silas Corbett?" the man called out. His voice carried authority without arrogance. "I'm Ranger Miller. Sorry to wake you, but we've got a situation. Missing child reported near Echo Canyon. Wondering if you've seen anything." Frost moved to the door. Her lips pulled back to expose teeth, but she made no sound now. Just that terrible silence of a predator calculating distance and trajectory. Silas kept his hand on the rifle. "Got ID?" he called through the door. The man reached for his belt, moving slowly, deliberately. He held up a badge that caught the porch light. Park Service. Looked legitimate from what Silas could see through the small window. Behind him, the boy had gone completely still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of prey trying to disappear. "Listen," Miller continued. "I know you're out here for privacy, and I respect that. But this kid's been missing since yesterday afternoon, 6 years old, family's desperate. If he's out there in this storm, we're running out of time." It was a good speech. Reasonable. Exactly what a real ranger would say. Silas wanted to believe it. Part of him needed to believe it, because the alternative meant the nightmare had already found them. "Haven't seen anyone," Silas said. "Storm's been bad. Nobody should be out in this. Mind if I come in? Warm up for a minute?" Miller gestured at the door. "Maybe you've got a radio I could use. Mine's not getting through this weather." Frost's growl started again, that same deep, guttural warning. Silas's eyes dropped to the man's feet. Standard protocol. You could fake a lot of things, but footwear told the truth. Rangers wore Danners or Solos, maybe Salomons if they were younger. Practical boots with good tread for the terrain. Miller wore something else entirely. Black tactical boots with a specific tread pattern Silas recognized from his military days. Bates 8-inch, the kind special operations wore. The kind mercenaries preferred because they worked in every environment and never failed. No ranger wore boots like that. They cost too much and drew too much attention. But private contractors loved them because they were the best tool for the job when the job involved violence. Silas's grip tightened on the rifle. His pulse stayed steady. Training kicked in, that cold clarity that came when you knew the shooting was about to start. "Sorry, Miller," Silas said, voice level. "Radio's been out for 2 days. Can't help you there." Through the window, he saw Miller's smile falter for just a second. A micro-expression that confirmed everything. "That's unfortunate," Miller said. His hand moved to his hip, resting on what Silas now recognized as a tactical holster, not the standard issue Rangers carried. "You sure I can't come in, just for a minute?" The boy made a sound. The first sound Silas had heard from him. Not a word. Just a sharp intake of breath, like someone about to drown. Frost moved in front of the couch, every muscle in her body coiled tight. The wolf wasn't looking at the door anymore. She was watching the windows, the dark corners, calculating angles of attack. That's when Silas understood. Miller wasn't alone. He was the distraction. The polite face meant to get the door open. The rest of them were already moving into position. "I think you should leave," Silas said. "Storm's getting worse. Not safe to be out." Miller's pleasant expression finally dropped. His eyes went flat and cold, the way a shark's eyes looked before it hit. "We can do this easy or hard, Corbett. Your choice. But that boy is coming with me either way." Silas didn't answer. He just stepped back from the window and checked the rifle again. Frost pressed against his leg, and he felt her body vibrating with restrained violence. The boy had pulled his knees to his chest. His eyes met Silas's across the room, and in them was a question that didn't need words. A question Silas had asked himself 3 years ago when everything burned. Are you going to run? Or are you going to fight? Outside, Miller stepped off the porch and spoke into a radio Silas couldn't see. His lips moved, forming words that got lost in the wind. But his hand signals were clear enough. They were coming in. 20 minutes passed in tense silence. Silas watched through the window as Miller paced the tree line, radio in hand, clearly waiting for something. Frost never moved from her position by the couch. The boy had fallen into an exhausted sleep, but his hands still gripped the blanket. Then headlights cut through the storm. An older Jeep Cherokee with county markings fought its way up the access road and stopped beside Miller's truck. The door opened, and Sheriff Clara Vance stepped out. Silas knew Clara. She'd been the one who'd let him disappear into these mountains 3 years ago without asking too many questions. A good cop in a small town, the kind who actually gave a damn about people. Her daughter Emma was 7, same age Silas's daughter would have been. Clara looked up at the cabin, and even from this distance, Silas could see something was wrong. Her posture was too rigid. Her hand stayed away from her service weapon, and when Miller approached her, she didn't react like a law enforcement officer greeting a colleague. She reacted like a hostage. The knock came again. This time it was Clara's voice. "Silas, it's me. I need to talk to you. It's important." Silas opened the door, but kept the rifle visible. Clara stood on the porch alone, but Miller waited 10 feet behind her, hands in his pockets, smile fixed in place. "Clara," Silas said carefully. "You okay?" Her eyes met his, and he saw fear there, raw and desperate. "I got a call about a missing child," she said. Her voice was steady but rehearsed. "Ranger Miller here says you might have information." Silas watched her hands. She was doing something subtle with her left hand, fingers moving in small gestures. Military hand signals, the kind they taught to special forces, not small-town sheriffs. But Clara's late husband had been Marines. Special operations. She'd know the signals. Compromised. Hostile force. Daughter in danger. "I already told Miller I haven't seen anyone," Silas said, keeping his eyes on her face. "Storm's been bad. Nobody's been up here." Clara's jaw tightened. Her right hand moved to her belt, and for a second Silas thought she was going for her gun. Instead, she pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. The photo showed Emma. She was sitting in what looked like the sheriff's office, hands zip-tied to a chair. A man in tactical gear stood behind her, face covered, gun visible. The timestamp read 18 minutes ago. Silas's blood went cold. He looked past Clara to Miller, who was still smiling that dead smile. "Here's the situation," Miller called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "Sheriff Vance has been very cooperative. She drove all the way up here in this terrible weather to help us resolve things peacefully. All we need is the boy. You hand him over, Emma goes home safe. Everyone walks away." Clara's eyes pleaded with him, not to comply, to understand. Her fingers moved again. More signals. Whole town. Bought. Apex. Apex. Silas knew that name. Private military contractor. The kind that operated in gray zones where governments couldn't officially go. They'd been involved in everything from overseas operations to domestic black bag work. If they wanted the boy badly enough to buy an entire town's silence, this wasn't about a custody dispute. "And if I don't?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Miller's smile widened. "Then we come in and take him anyway. And Emma doesn't get to see her 8th birthday. And Sheriff Vance here gets to live with the knowledge that she could have prevented it." He paused. We've got 12 men positioned around this cabin. You're good, Corbett. I know your record. But you're not that good. Clara's face had gone pale. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but her voice stayed level. Please, Silas, just give them what they want. It's not worth dying for a kid you don't even know. But that was the thing. Silas did know this kid. Not his name, not his history. But he knew what the boy represented. A chance to save someone when it mattered. A chance to not fail again the way he'd failed his own family. Behind him, Frost made a low sound. Not a growl. Something else. A question, maybe. Or a statement. We fight or we run, but we don't surrender. Silas looked at Clara and saw his answer in her eyes. She knew what he was going to do. She'd known before she drove up here. And she was begging him anyway, because that's what a mother had to do. I'm sorry, Clara, Silas said quietly. I can't. Her shoulders dropped. Relief and grief mixed together. She'd done what they'd forced her to do. Now whatever happened wasn't on her conscience. Miller's smile finally disappeared. Wrong answer, old man. He spoke into his radio. All units, go loud. Take the cabin. Clara turned and walked back toward her jeep. As she passed Miller, her hand brushed her hip. A flare fell into the snow, small and red and barely visible. A warning, or a gift, or both. Silas slammed the door and threw the deadbolt. It wouldn't hold long. Nothing would. But it might buy them enough time. The boy was awake now, watching him with those dark eyes that had already seen too much violence. Time to move, Silas said. The sound started before Silas could reach the boy. Not a mechanical whir or engine noise. Something higher, sharper, a frequency that bypassed his ears and went straight into his skull like ice picks driving through bone. Frost howled. An actual howl of pain, not the warning sounds she'd made before. Her body convulsed and she collapsed on the floor, legs twitching, foam forming at her mouth. The wolf's eyes rolled back, showing white, and her breathing came in rapid, shallow gasps. Silas knew that sound. Acoustic weapons. LRAD systems maybe, or something worse. Military tech designed to incapacitate without permanent damage. Though the permanent part was debatable, if you'd been on the receiving end. He tried to move toward Frost, but his own body had other ideas. The frequency hit something primal in his nervous system. His hands started shaking, then his arms. His vision tunneled, and suddenly he wasn't in his cabin anymore. He was back in the wildfire. Smoke filled his lungs. Heat seared his skin. He could hear Sarah screaming his daughter's name. Could smell burning wood and worse things burning. The radio crackled with evacuation orders that came too late. The fire crowned in the trees above their house, and he was running. Running, but not fast enough. Never fast enough. His rifle clattered to the floor. Silas dropped to his knees, hands clutching his head. The sound wasn't stopping. It built and built until his teeth ached and his eyes watered and every muscle in his body locked tight. Through the window, he could see them. 3 drones, each about the size of a basketball, hovering 20 feet from the cabin. Speakers mounted underneath pulsed with that terrible frequency. Tactical lights swept the interior, finding him, holding him in their beams. The boy had pressed himself into the corner, hands over his ears, mouth open in a silent scream that nobody would ever hear. His small body trembled with the sonic assault, but he couldn't make noise to release the pain. He could only endure. Silas tried to stand. His legs wouldn't cooperate. The PTSD had him now, dragging him under. He was seizing, body jerking with muscle spasms he couldn't control. His mind knew what was happening. His body didn't care. It was back in the fire, and this time There was no escape. That's when Frost moved. The wolf shouldn't have been able to move. The acoustic weapon had locked her nervous system the same way it had locked Silas's. But something deeper than nerve impulses drove her forward. Something older than pain. She dragged herself across the floor, legs barely functioning, pulling her weight with pure determination. Blood dripped from her ears where the pressure had ruptured something delicate inside. But her eyes had cleared, and they were fixed on Silas with absolute focus. Frost reached him and did something Silas had never seen her do. She climbed on top of him. All 140 pounds of white wolf pressed down on his chest, pinning him to the floor. Her weight stopped his convulsions, forcing his body to go still. Her massive head lowered until her muzzle touched his forehead, and she made a sound that cut through the acoustic assault. A whine, low and steady. The sound a mother makes to calm her pups. The sound that said, "You're safe, I've got you, breathe." Silas gasped. His lungs filled with air. The fire receded slightly. He could feel Frost's heartbeat against his chest, slow and strong, and his own heart began to match the rhythm. The wolf's breath warmed his face, carrying the scent of pine and snow and wild things. The drones adjusted their frequency, trying to find the setting that would break them both. The sound changed, dropped lower, became a vibration that rattled Silas's ribs. Frost's body absorbed most of it, sheltering him with her mass, and somehow that act of protection gave him something to focus on besides the nightmare. His hand found her fur, gripped it, held on. The boy appeared in his fractured vision. Small hands touched Frost's side, then Silas's shoulder. The child couldn't speak, couldn't cry out, but his presence added weight to reality. 3 of them together, holding each other through the assault. Outside, Miller's voice echoed through a loudspeaker. "Last chance, Corbett. Send the boy out, or we turn the frequency up until something in your head breaks permanently." Silas tried to answer, but his jaw was locked. Frost pressed harder against him, her body shaking with the effort of fighting the sonic weapon. Blood ran from her nose now, too. But she didn't move, didn't back down. The boy's hand tightened on Silas's shoulder, and through the pain and chaos, Silas understood. This child had watched someone fail to protect him before, had been abandoned when protection mattered most. And now he was waiting to see if history would repeat itself. Silas forced his hand to move, reached out, found the boy's small fingers and held them tight. Not this time. Not again. The drones screamed their mechanical fury. Frost whimpered, but stayed firm. And somewhere in the white noise and pain, Silas felt his mind start to clear. The fire was still there. It would always be there. But so was this moment. So were these lives, depending on him. He just had to hold on long enough to figure out what came next. The drones finally pulled back. The frequency stopped, leaving behind a ringing silence that hurt almost as much as the sound. Silas lay on the floor with Frost still pressed against his chest, both of them breathing hard, blood streaking the wolf's white fur. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Not the clean wood smoke from his stove. This was different. Chemical. Accelerant mixed with pine sap and dry winter brush. The smell that lived in his nightmares. Silas forced himself to sit up. Frost rolled off him, whimpering, her legs still weak. Through the window, orange light flickered between the trees. Miller had stopped trying to extract them quietly. Now he was going to burn them out. The fire spread fast. Too fast. They weren't just lighting the brush. Someone was moving through the tree line with a flamethrower, painting streams of liquid fire across the forest, setting a perimeter that would collapse inward like a noose. Silas's hand started shaking again. Not from the sonic weapon this time. from memory, from the feeling of helplessness as flames devoured everything he loved while he stood frozen, unable to move, unable to save them. Smoke began seeping through the cabin's old chinking. The boy coughed once, twice, his small frame convulsing with the effort. His eyes found Silas, and in them was a question that cut deeper than any blade. Are you going to save me? Or are you going to let the fire win again? Silas tried to stand. His legs buckled. The smell was too much. The heat building against the walls was too much. He was back there again, watching his house burn, hearing Sarah scream his daughter's name over and over. And he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there and let it all turn to ash. Frost struggled to her feet and pressed against him, but even the wolf's presence couldn't pull him back this time. The fire had him. The past had him. And he was drowning in it. The boy moved closer. His small hand reached out and grabbed Silas's arm, shaking it. When that didn't work, he grabbed harder, nails digging into skin. But Silas was somewhere else, locked in a memory that played on an endless loop. Outside, a figure moved past the window. Tall, heavily armored, carrying a weapon that spat streams of liquid fire into the trees. The figure turned, and firelight caught his face through the face shield. Silas's blood froze for a different reason. He knew that face. Older now, harder, but unmistakable. James Garrett, former firefighter, former colleague, the man who'd been court-martialed for setting illegal backfires during containment operations, the man who'd disappeared before his trial, leaving behind whispers about private contracts and black ops work. The man who'd been working the same fire 3 years ago when Sarah and Lily died. Memory crashed into present. That fire hadn't been natural. The investigation said probable human cause, likely a campfire or cigarette. But Silas had known the patterns were wrong, known the spread was too deliberate. He'd pushed for more investigation, and his superiors had quietly suggested he take early retirement and stop asking questions. Now he understood why. Garrett had been working for Apex even then, setting fires to cover operations, and Silas's family had been collateral damage in whatever mission they'd been running. The rage that hit him was clean and cold. It burned away the paralysis, the fear, everything except crystal-clear purpose. This wasn't random. This was personal. And this time, he wasn't going to freeze. But his body still wouldn't move. The PTSD had its claws too deep. Smoke filled the cabin now, thick and choking. The boy coughed harder, tears streaming down his face. Then the child did something that changed everything. He opened his mouth and screamed. Not words. He couldn't make words. But sound came out anyway. A raw, agonized cry that tore from somewhere deep inside where pain lived beyond language. The sound of a child who'd been silent through abuse, through abandonment, through every horror his short life had offered. Silent because silence kept him safe. But now safety was gone. Now there was only fire and smoke and a broken man who was supposed to protect him, but couldn't even protect himself. The scream lasted 3 seconds. Then the boy's voice gave out, and he collapsed against Silas's chest, sobbing without sound, his small body shaking with effort and pain. That scream reached something the sonic weapon couldn't touch. Reached past the PTSD, past the guilt, past 3 years of self-destruction. Because this child had given up his only defense to wake Silas from his nightmare, had sacrificed his silence to save them both. Silas's arms closed around the boy. His mind cleared. The fire was still there. The smoke was real. Garrett was outside with murder in his eyes. But so was this moment. So was this child who'd just proven he was worth saving. "I've got you," Silas whispered against the boy's hair. "I've got you, and I'm not letting go." The trapdoor under the rug had been Silas's insurance policy. 3 years of paranoia translated into a hidden escape route that dropped 8 feet into a crawlspace he'd dug himself. He'd told himself it was about preparedness. Really, it was about never being trapped again. He pulled up the rug with one hand while holding the boy with the other. Frost understood immediately. The wolf dropped through the opening first, landing hard but steady. Silas lowered the boy down, felt small hands grip his wrists, then let go. The child fell into darkness and Frost's waiting presence. Smoke filled the cabin now, thick enough to choke on. Flames licked at the windows. Silas grabbed his go-bag from the closet, the one he'd kept packed since the day he moved in. Ammunition, first aid, emergency rations, everything he'd need to survive in the mountains. He dropped through the trapdoor and pulled it shut behind him. Above, he heard boots on the porch, voices shouting, the front door splintering under a battering ram. They'd find the cabin empty and assume the occupants had burned. By the time they realized their mistake, Silas would be gone. The crawlspace tunnel ran 30 yards before opening into a natural drainage culvert. Silas had reinforced it over the years, making it wide enough for a man to crawl through on hands and knees. Frost led the way, her white fur barely visible in the absolute darkness. The boy followed, moving quickly despite his fear. They emerged 100 yards from the cabin, hidden by rocks and scrub pine. Fire painted the night sky orange. Silas could hear Miller barking orders, coordinating his men to search the perimeter. They had minutes at best before someone spotted the tunnel exit. Silas pulled the boy close and pointed up the mountain. Gray Peak loomed above them, nearly invisible against the night sky. 14,000 feet of rock and ice and death traps for anyone who didn't know the terrain. But Silas knew every inch. He'd spent 3 years exploring these mountains, learning their secrets. The climb started immediately. No trails, no easy routes. Just straight up through terrain that would break most men's spirit before it broke their bodies. The boy struggled, his small legs unable to keep pace. Silas lifted him onto his back, feeling the child's arms wrap around his neck. Frost ranged ahead, finding paths invisible in the darkness. Her ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds. Behind them, flashlight beams swept the tree line. Someone had found the tunnel. The first trap Silas set was simple. A deadfall snare using a boulder he'd positioned months ago, held in place by a trigger wire stretched across the path. Anyone following their route would trip it, and 200 pounds of rock would come down like judgment. He heard it spring 30 seconds after they passed, followed by a scream that cut off abruptly. Miller's voice echoed up the mountain. Angry now, frustrated, good. Angry men made mistakes. They climbed higher. The boy's breathing came in ragged gasps. The altitude was hitting him hard, but he didn't complain. Couldn't complain. Just held on while Silas pushed through burning leg muscles and screaming lungs. The second trap was more sophisticated. Silas had cached supplies all over this mountain. One of those caches held 50 feet of paracord and a commercial bear trap he'd found abandoned. He rigged it across a narrow ledge, covered it with pine needles and snow. Set the trigger tension low enough that a careless step would spring it. The scream that followed was worse than the first. A man learning what it felt like to have steel jaws close on his ankle. Miller's voice again, shouting orders to fall back, regroup, watch for traps. But they were still coming. Silas could hear at least 6 sets of boots scrambling up the rocks below. Professional, determined. They'd lost 2 men, but that wouldn't stop them. Apex didn't quit, they just adapted. At 8,000 feet, Silas stopped in a natural overhang. His chest heaved. The boy slid off his back, legs wobbling. Frost's tongue hung from her mouth, breath steaming in the freezing air. They needed rest, needed water. But stopping meant dying. The boy touched Silas's arm and pointed down. Below them, flashlight beams moved in coordinated patterns. They were spreading out, trying to flank. Smart. Miller was adapting faster than Silas had hoped. Silas pulled the rifle from his shoulder and checked the scope. 600-yard shot downhill in darkness. Impossible for most people. But Silas had been a designated marksman in his unit. Had made shots other men called miracles. He found Miller in the scope. The man was directing his team, completely exposed. One shot, one trigger pull. End this now. But killing Miller wouldn't save Emma, wouldn't stop Apex. And Silas wasn't that person anymore. Wasn't the soldier who could pull the trigger without hesitation. He lowered the rifle. The boy watched him with those dark eyes. Understanding, maybe, or disappointment. Hard to tell. Frost pressed against them both. The wolf's instincts were simpler. Protect the pack, kill the hunters, survive another day. They kept climbing. The mountain would do the killing for them if they were patient, if they were smart, and if the boy could hold on just a little longer. The bridge appeared at 10,000 feet. An old logging span, half-rotted, stretching across a ravine that dropped 200 feet into darkness. Silas had crossed it dozens of times, always alone, always carefully. Now he had to get a 6-year-old and an exhausted wolf across before Miller's team caught up. The boy looked at the bridge and shook his head, fear plain on his face. The wooden planks were spaced too far apart for small legs. Half of them were missing entirely. Wind howled through the gap, making the whole structure sway. Silas knelt down. "I'll carry you. Trust me." The boy's eyes said he'd heard that before, from people who'd betrayed that trust. But he climbed onto Silas's back anyway, because there was no other choice. Frost went first, testing each plank with her weight before committing. The wood groaned under her paws, but held. She was halfway across when the shot came. The crack of the rifle echoed across the ravine. Frost jerked sideways, her back leg buckling. She stumbled, nearly fell through a gap in the planks, then caught herself on 3 legs. Blood spread across her white fur, black in the moonlight. Silas's heart stopped. He looked back and saw the sniper's position. A red dot danced across the bridge, looking for its next target. Looking for him. Frost understood faster than Silas did. The wolf lunged forward with everything she had left, drawing the sniper's attention. The red dot followed her. Another shot cracked out, missed. Frost reached the far side and collapsed behind an outcrop of rock, out of the line of fire. The distraction gave Silas the seconds he needed. He ran. The boy clung to his back, arms tight around his neck. Planks splintered under Silas's boots. The bridge swayed violently. Behind them, Miller's voice shouted orders to hold fire. They made it across, barely. Silas dove behind the rocks where Frost lay panting, her injured legs stretched out at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled beneath her, steaming in the cold air. The boy slid off Silas's back and immediately went to the wolf. His small hands hovered over the wound, wanting to help but afraid to hurt her more. Silas did the quick assessment his training demanded. Entry wound high on the left rear leg. No exit wound. The bullet was still in there, probably lodged against bone. Blood flow was steady but not arterial. She might survive if he could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. Might. He pulled out his medical kit with shaking hands. Field surgery on a wolf, in a cave, at 10,000 feet, with mercenaries closing in. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. Frost's eyes found his. The wolf was in shock, breathing too fast, but her gaze stayed steady, trusting. She'd taken that bullet meant for him, had drawn fire to save them. And now she was waiting to see if he could return the favor. Silas's hands stopped shaking. He worked quickly, cut away fur around the wound, poured antiseptic that made Frost's body go rigid with pain, found the bullet with forceps, extracted it with trembling fingers. The wolf never made a sound, just watched him with those ice-blue eyes. It's blue, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. The bullet had nicked something important, an artery maybe, or damaged tissue that wouldn't clot properly. Silas applied pressure, used clotting powder, tried everything in his kit. Nothing worked fast enough. Frost's breathing grew shallow. Her eyes started to lose focus. Blood kept flowing between Silas's fingers, no matter how hard he pressed. The boy pushed forward. He grabbed Silas's knife from the medical kit before Silas could stop him. Then he did something that made Silas's breath catch. The child pressed the blade against his own palm and cut. Not deep, but enough. Blood welled up, and the boy held his hand over Frost's wound, letting his blood drip onto the injury. "No, don't," Silas started to say. But then he saw it. The bleeding was slowing. Not stopping, but definitely slowing. The boy's blood mixing with Frost's seemed to help the clotting process in a way the powder hadn't. It was medically impossible. Blood types between humans and wolves shouldn't be compatible. But Silas had seen stranger things in field hospitals, had seen bodies do impossible things to survive. And right now, impossible was all they had. The boy kept his hand steady, letting his blood flow until Silas could get proper bandaging in place. By the time they finished, both the child and the wolf were pale from blood loss. But Frost was breathing easier. The hemorrhaging had stopped. Silas sat back against the cave wall, suddenly exhausted. His hands were covered in blood, Frost's, the boy's, all mixed together. Frost shifted, dragging herself closer despite the pain. She stretched her neck and licked Silas's face where tears had started falling without him noticing. Her tongue was rough and warm, and the gesture was so achingly gentle that something broke inside him. He pulled the wolf's head against his chest and let himself cry. For his family. For this wolf who kept saving him. For a silent boy who'd cut himself to save them both. For everything lost and everything somehow, impossibly, found again. The boy pressed against them both. 3 survivors holding each other while the mountain tried to kill them and men with guns waited below. Outside the cave, dawn was coming. And with it, the final confrontation. Miller found them at dawn, not by tracking, by waiting. He was standing on the summit of Gray Peak when Silas climbed over the final ridge, the boy on his back and Frost limping behind, like he'd known exactly where they'd go. "End of the line, Corbett," Miller said. He held his rifle casually, pointed at the ground, confident. "Took you longer than I expected. Thought the old PTSD would break you hours ago?" Silas set the boy down gently. His own rifle was on his shoulder, but Miller had the advantage. High ground, better position. And Silas was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical. "You knew," Silas said. "About the fire, about my family." Miller smiled. "We know everything about you. That's how this works. We find the broken people, the ones living off-grid, the ones nobody will miss if things go sideways." He gestured at the boy. "But this isn't about you. It was never about you." The boy pressed against Silas's leg. His small body trembled, but whether from cold or fear, Silas couldn't tell. "Let me guess," Miller continued. You think you're protecting an innocent kid from bad guys. Classic hero complex. But you don't even know who he is, do you? Silas said nothing, just watched Miller's trigger finger, watched for the micro movements that meant shooting was about to start. Miller laughed. That boy you've been risking your life for? His name is Leo Castellano. Ring any bells? He waited. No. Let me enlighten you. His father is Marcus Castellano, head of Apex Corporation, net worth around $40 billion, controls half the private military contracts in the Eastern Hemisphere. The words hit Silas like physical blows. He looked down at the boy. Leo. The child stared back with those dark eyes that suddenly made terrible sense. Marcus wanted a legacy, Miller said. Someone to take over the empire. But Leo here was born with a defect. Can't talk. Can't ever talk. And Marcus doesn't tolerate imperfection. His voice went cold. So he designed a solution. Embedded a digital key in Leo's body. Biometric encrypted. Can't be removed without killing the kid. That key accesses every Apex account, every offshore fund. $40 billion that Leo can unlock with a fingerprint and retinal scan. Silas felt sick. You were going to kill him. We were going to retire him, Miller corrected. Painlessly, professionally. Then access the accounts and disappear before Marcus figured out what happened. Clean, simple. Would have been over in 5 minutes if his nanny hadn't run with him during the extraction. The boy's hand gripped Silas's jacket, Silas's, small fingers digging in. He understood. Maybe not the words, but the intent. He'd been running from men who wanted him dead for money. Thing is, Miller continued, we still need that access code. And Leo's the only one who has it. So here's the deal. You walk away. Forget this happened. We take Leo, get what we need, and everyone goes home, happy. Except Leo. Miller shrugged. Kid was dead anyway. Marcus doesn't want him. Never did. We're just speeding up the inevitable. Frost growled. The sound was weak, strained from her injury. But the intent was clear, over her dead body. Miller's rifle came up fast, not pointed at Silas, pointed at Frost. I've had enough of that animal. Should have put her down first thing. Everything slowed down. Silas saw Miller's finger tighten on the trigger. Saw Frost try to move, but her injured leg couldn't support her weight. Saw Leo's eyes go wide with understanding. Then Frost did something impossible. The wolf that could barely stand suddenly launched herself forward with every ounce of strength left in her body. Not at Miller, at Silas. She hit him like a freight train, knocking him sideways just as Miller's shot cracked out. The bullet meant for Silas whistled past his ear. He went down hard, Frost on top of him again, protecting him again, always protecting him. Miller cursed and worked the bolt, aimed at Silas again. But Frost wasn't done. The wolf pushed off Silas with her front legs and lunged at Miller. 40 feet separated them. 40 feet of rock and ice, an impossible distance for an animal bleeding out from a gunshot wound. Frost covered it in 3 strides. Her body was a white blur against gray stone. Miller swung his rifle around, but he was too slow. The wolf hit him chest high, jaws closing on his throat, and they both went over the edge. Silas scrambled forward, but Leo grabbed his arm, held him back. Together they watched as wolf and man tumbled down the cliff face, locked together, falling toward the fog-shrouded rocks below. The impact came several seconds later. Final. Absolute. Silas sank to his knees. His breath came in ragged gasps. Frost was gone. The wolf who'd saved him over and over. The only family he'd had left. Gone. Leo's small hand touched his face, turned it so their eyes met. The boy's cheeks were wet with tears, but in his expression was something Silas hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pain, gratitude. This child had lost everything too, had been unwanted, abandoned, hunted. But he'd found someone willing to fight for him anyway, someone who'd chosen him when his own father hadn't. In the distance, helicopter rotors echoed across the mountains. Someone was coming. Friend or enemy, Silas didn't know. Didn't care. He pulled Leo close and held on while the sun rose over Gray Peak, painting the snow in shades of red and gold. The helicopters belonged to the FBI. Clara had managed to send a distress signal before Apex took her daughter. A single encrypted burst that took 3 hours to decode and another 2 to mobilize a tactical response team. By the time they reached Gray Peak, the battle was over. Federal agents found Silas and Leo huddled together on the summit, hypothermic and bleeding but alive. They found Miller's body at the base of the cliff, neck broken, and 20 feet away, they found Frost. The wolf was still breathing. The veterinary surgeon at the ranger station said it was impossible, said the fall should have killed her, said the blood loss alone should have been fatal. But Frost's heart kept beating, and her eyes tracked Silas when he stood by the operating table. They saved her. Barely. 3 surgeries and 6 weeks of recovery. The wolf would never run the same, would always limp on that back leg. But she was alive. 6 months later, Silas stood in the kitchen of a small house just outside the national park boundary. Not his old cabin. Somewhere new. Somewhere that didn't smell like smoke and fear. Leo sat at the table doing homework. Real homework from a real school where teachers knew about his condition and worked with him anyway. The boy had grown 2 inches, put on weight. His face had color now instead of that pale, haunted look. Frost lay by the wood stove, her white fur clean and brushed. She slept more these days, moved slower. But when Leo laughed at something in his book, the wolf's tail thumped against the floor. Silas poured coffee and watched the scene with something that felt dangerously close to peace. He still had nightmares. Still woke up screaming sometimes. But Leo would appear in his doorway, and Frost would pad into the room. And together, they'd sit until the ghosts faded. The speech therapist came twice a week. She said Leo's vocal cords were underdeveloped but functional. Said with work, he might manage simple words. Maybe more. The boy tried hard, his face scrunching with concentration as he formed sounds that almost resembled language. Then one morning, Leo woke up and looked at Frost sleeping by his bed. His mouth opened, and a word came out. Not perfect, slightly slurred, but unmistakable. Frost. Silas was in the kitchen when he heard it. He dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't notice. He just stood there while Leo said it again, clearer this time. Frost. The wolf's eyes opened, her head lifted, and Silas could have sworn she smiled. That afternoon, Silas finally opened the dog tag Leo wore around his neck. The boy had never let anyone touch it before. But now he unclasped it himself and handed it to Silas with a solemn expression. Silas expected a code. Numbers. Something that would explain why Apex wanted this child dead. Instead, he found a photograph sealed in plastic. Old, faded, bent at the corners. The picture showed Silas 15 years younger, in military fatigues, arm around another man's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. Behind them, a transport truck, a fire base somewhere in Afghanistan. Silas's hands started shaking. He knew that face. Danny Castellano, his spotter, his best friend, the man who'd pushed him out of the way when the IED detonated, the man who'd taken the blast meant for Silas and died before the medevac arrived. He turned the photo over. On the back, in Danny's handwriting. For Silas, in case I don't make it. Take care of what matters. Understanding crashed over him. Danny Castellano, Marcus Castellano, brothers. Danny had mentioned a brother once. Wealthy, powerful, someone he'd grown distant from. Leo wasn't just a random child. He was Danny's son. The nephew Silas never knew existed. And somehow, impossibly, Danny had arranged for this moment, had left instructions, had made sure that if anything happened to him, Silas would be the one to protect his boy. Silas looked at Leo. The boy watched him with those dark eyes that suddenly looked so much like Danny's. Your father, Silas whispered. He saved my life. Leo nodded, like he'd always known, like he'd been waiting for Silas to understand. Silas pulled the boy into a hug. His first family had been taken by fire. His second family had been given to him by a friend who'd seen the future and prepared for it. A silent child who needed someone to fight for him. A white wolf who'd needed someone to save. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle. Nothing like the blizzard that had brought them together. Frost limped to the window and watched the flakes accumulate. Leo pressed against Silas's side. Home, the boy said. His second word, harder than the first. But he got it out. And Silas realized it was true. This was home, not a place to hide, not a tomb for guilt and grief. Just home. With a boy who was learning to speak, and a wolf who was learning to trust again, and a man who was learning that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. Danny had known, had seen past Silas's pain to the guardian underneath, had trusted him with the most precious thing in the world. Silas wouldn't fail that trust, not this time, not ever again. Thank you for staying with Silas, Leo and Frost through their journey. Stories like these remind us that second chances can come from the most unexpected places, and that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when it matters most. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had an animal companion who seemed to understand you better than people did? Or maybe you've experienced your own second chance at happiness when you least expected it. Share your story with us. This community is built on these connections, and I read every single comment. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. We share new stories every week about the unbreakable bonds between people and the animals who choose to love them. Stories about courage, redemption, and the quiet strength it takes to start over. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you know someone who might need to hear a story about hope and healing today, share this with them. Until next time, take care of each other. And remember, sometimes the family we need finds us exactly when we're ready to be found.